I just wanted to do a quick video, kind of touch base, and it's always helpful to see somebody when instead of just looking at the blank screen on Blackboard all the time. I wanted to kind of talk about our transition from fiction into poetry. I've been reading through a lot of your stuff, and I really like the depth of thought that you are putting into your discussion boards. So I think it's great. I'm really enjoying reading them. Um, so let's talk about a few things. Uh, a lot of you have said that poetry is not really your thing. You've read um, the standard high school English type poetry, Edgar Allan Poe and things like that. That's what most of you could remember. But there's a whole lot of poetry out there. Poetry has been around for quite a while. It was the original kind of writing back when that was the art form, that was the entertainment form. People would tell stories through poetry, recite poetry, and it's really developed a whole lot over the millennia that several thousands of years that poetry has been around. We've gone from primarily spoken word through written text, and then lots of fun experimentation. So some of you reference like E. E. Cummings and other people. They've really taken poetry and moved it into something else because poetry has become a kind of a visual medium as well as a oral or auditory medium as well. So I'm gonna hope that you'll find something you actually like to read. Um, you're not gonna need to. You're not going to see everything that you'll enjoy, but that's all right. We'll expose you to some things. So let's first look at these elements of fiction or parts of fiction. We know the elements of fiction that stories are there because they're here to tell a story, that we have characters we can relate to. They're set in a place and time. It might move over a long period of time. It really depends on um, kind of how big the story is or what the purpose. But overall, we see a lot of movement in time from one point to another point. Sometimes it'll move back and forth, have flashbacks, but overall, there's a narrative arc. The story is going to develop, and through that, we'll get our theme. I like to think of story as, in comparison, as a video or a film. We can think of short stories translating into a film really well. When we come to poetry, you'll see that there's a whole lot of different parts out there. We know that there's different styles. Some of you might have only read narrative or lyric poetry. Some of you might only think of formal poetry, whether it's a form like a haiku or a sonnet. But there's countless, probably somebody has counted it, but there's a whole lot of different forms of poetry out there, and you just kind of have to keep digging and find your right one. There's also a lot of literary devices within poetry, looking at rhythm and meter, rhyme. We often think of poems that rhyme or have some sort of meter to it. Um, Formal poetry, like sonnets, will have their own specific rhyme scheme and meter. We also have the use of imagery and symbolism. But we also have the speaker, which is what we've been looking at um, this week. We'll be looking at the speaker, and that's someone talking to us. We know that we can't always assume that the poet is the one who is speaking. So some poems may be autobiographical, but not all of them are. We just assume that even if we know it's autobiographical, we will think it's somebody else. So we got to displace who is speaking to us. But in general, it's a more intimate type of writing where it's almost like conversation. Um, we know that themes are integral to the poem, that we're reading primarily for a theme or something. But when I think of time in a poem, it's a capturing of a moment. It's uh, kind of suspending everything in time, even though narrative poems, they often go away from that because they're there to tell a story. But many of the poems we'll be reading is trying to freeze time and explore and look at this situation. Again, we're reading about situation this week as well. So I like to think of poems as a snapshot or a photo compared to stories, film, or video. And film, you can look at each individual frame, but you're more interested in how it kind of all works together over a period of time from the beginning to the end. Whereas a poem, as a snapshot or a photo, you can study and look at all those little elements within that single picture. and you can look around and you can draw meaning from that. So if we want to look at all this kind of thought in action, we can look at our stories of Hills Like White Elephant and The Story of an Hour, which we read, I think, 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. Really nice short stories. They're dealing with social issues that women were facing at that time regarding women's position in society, and then also getting pregnant by a foreign man. And what are you going to do? So we see how these female characters are treated and talked to. We need to see those things. Otherwise, we don't understand why Jig is doing what she does or why Mrs. Mallard feels the way she feels after her husband's death. We need to see and interpret these reactions of the female characters. Those things are going to help us uh, understand more. And we say, okay, well, we understand why Mrs. Mallard isn't so sad. She changes her view, and she's mourning her husband. She is sad, but she's also thinking about all these possibilities that she has. Same thing with Jig. I mean, she's being pressured by the American man to have this abortion, and she's, saying, "Wait a minute, you get to go away. You're going to leave me, and I'm stuck no matter what." So she's kind of really putting all this together. And we don't know if Jig is American or what her deal is, but we just see her as this kind of I don't want to say victim, but just somebody that the action's being done to until the end. We see the development of that to the ending where Jig comes out and says, "Well, there's nothing wrong with me," and because that can be interpreted different ways, we can say there's nothing wrong with me, or there's nothing wrong with me, or there's nothing wrong with me. Um, we can interpret it those different ways and think about maybe she's calling the other guy, the guy, a jerk, or she's trying to say something's wrong with you, or she's trying to say, hey, you know, um, we're going through with it and you can't talk me into an abortion, that sort of stuff. We get the irony with Mrs. Mallard um, dying of joy from seeing her husband when really it's a literal broken heart. If we compare that to something like Daystar, which we're reading this week from Rita Dove, it's the speaker is revealing her life as a list of duties. She's out there doing laundry, changing diapers, very mundane sort of stuff. And it's this piece, she says, okay, well, I have this hour to myself, and then it's gone. And then she doesn't even have her night to herself because her husband, wants to get it on with her. And she's like, oh, geez, let me just sleep. And it's that moment that's captured throughout the day, excuse me, that is this exhaustion. The very words in there, slumped over and things like that, are cues. We see it. It's a day in the life, and everything is revolving around this idea. I just want to be nothing for a little while, enjoy that peace and quiet. And we can understand. We relate to these things, and as they're described. And as we read, we can start to feel, well, maybe that's almost happening to me too, as a reader. So in a way, poetry will transfer the feeling or the sentiment within the poem. It's meant to do that. Again, I mentioned before, it's kind of this intimate conversation between the speaker and you, the reader, whereas a story doesn't always do that. Stories mass appeal in a way, and everybody's hearing the story. And I'm sorry if this thing jumping back and forth is giving you a headache. I didn't think about this in the slider bar causing issues. Anyway, so we'll move on. A Rose for Emily. When we think how the theme is very strong, Emily's holding on to the past. She's afraid of change and can't accept death. This plot builds over time, and in fact, it kind of jumps around, and the narrator is kind of the village or the town telling a story because it's from this plural first person we went into the house and saw these things. It takes a lot of time. It covers a lot of time because in order to get the main theme across, we have to have a lot of time pass from her childhood all the way up to her death. But as a result, we start to look at mortality. What is it that we leave behind when we die? What are we leaving anyway? And do people ever give us up? I think it's a Banksy quote, right? Is that you're not truly dead until the last person that remembers you speaks your name, and that goes all the way back to um, not Greek mythology, but ancient Greek kind of ideas of mortality and telling someone's story in Greek poetry, and this idea of kleos, of immortality through people telling your story and living on. That's what the Iliad is, the story of Achilles, or the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus. Anyway, so that's when you think about a poem, though. She dwelt among untrodden ways, which we read, or is on our little list of readings from last week. Wordsworth's speaker is mourning a death. We don't really know who Lucy is, but he has a series of poems that kind of speak about Lucy, but we don't know much about her aside from these like 3 or 4 poems called the Lucy poems. We just don't know. And he doesn't give us any clues, or the speaker doesn't give any clues, but we feel this weight of her loss, that she dwelled among untrodden ways, and nobody knew she was alive, really. No one knew when she died, but here's a tombstone, a marker of her, and we can look and question again mortality and is the meaning of our lives. And he says, knowing that no one know her makes a difference to me. We hear the speaker and we think about it. Well, what does he mean? And it's the idea of, if no one knew you were alive, were you truly alive, or what? And so we have this snapshot of a moment where the sentiment or the feeling gets transferred to us, or at least it should be, but it's kind of sometimes clouded in these words, where we have to stop and think, whereas a story is going to often give it to you directly, not always, and there's going to be hidden meaning if we think about like recitative, if I'm pronouncing that Christ correctly, but recitative, I didn't know, that's how I would pronounce it, I have to look it up, but we think about that story where the ambiguity of race is there, but that was intentionally done. And poems will do that too. They'll be ambiguous, but um, I think we expect that. So with poetry, we often have to process it, take a moment to read it out loud, study that photo, look at what words might mean specific things, and that might make poetry a little easier for you to read, to think about what is it the poet is trying to do. And we'll look at some poets who are also fiction writers. Like we read something this week by Margaret Atwood, who is known for *Handmaid's Tale*, but she started out as a literary critic and a poet. So to write this poem, but then move on to fiction, and you decide, well, is this a moment that I want to capture for a poem, or is this something I want to tell in a story? And how can we do those things for our readers? And so think about the poet and what the poet's trying to do as you read. So I hope this week goes well for you, and look forward to reading your discussion boards.